Thank you very much, Amina. It is great to have such a priority being given to this topic at the most senior levels of the UN, and we found everything you said extremely inspirational. I'm Joan MacNaughton, I'm chair of the Climate Group, and I'd like to add my welcome to all of you to Climate Week New York. I'm now going to invite the panel members for the session which is beginning onto the stage, and I'll follow practice in not attempting to go into the biographies of such a distinguished group, because we would then actually eat into the time. So if I could please invite Nicolas Hulot, who's the Ministre d'État, and that's the Minister for the Ecological and Inclusive Transition in France, Ministre. The Honourable McKenna, who's the Minister of Environment and Climate Change in Canada. Welcome, Minister. And Lawrence H. Summers, who's the former US Treasury Secretary. My task is to enable them to talk for the next 20 minutes in an interactive and conversational way. They've agreed not to make speeches, but to answer some questions, which is very kind of them. And we're focusing on how you build the broader coalitions that are needed for action. And the emphasis is on action and not talk. And that is at national level, at international level, and it's also among the actors at subnational level. That's the states, the cities, the regions, and we heard about the Under 2 coalition, which is in the forefront of that earlier this morning, and of which the Climate Group is proud to be the secretariat. And of course, we mustn't forget the role of business. And probably we need to bring all of those groups together. So if I could start with Mr. Hulot, and your government, led by President Macron, is an exemplar. It's showing leadership in trying to bring people together from left and right of politics, as you yourself have done outside government for many years. How critical is this? How successful will it be? What are your plans for building greater ambition?
Thank you. Our plan is quite simple: more ambition. Because ambition works. If we don't scale up our ambition, how are we going to reduce the price for everybody? So, as you know, Paris Agreement is not a static agreement, it's a dynamic agreement. So, it's why France decided alone to go further than its commitment we have took in Paris. But we must also do more coalition about tools who are important to give you a chance to get the 1.5 we have to join. First, and it is what we start to do with Canada and other countries, reinforce to increase the coalition about the price of carbon. Very important. To reinforce a coalition about the end of all subsidies for fossil energy. We must also support all the initiatives, like the Renewable Initiative for Africa or the Solar Alliance in India. All these initiatives are going in the good direction. And also, we must have this target for neutral emission in 2050. That's the only solution.
Thank you, Minister. And I'm sure we'll come back to one or two of the themes you mentioned, including...
I will give you later the plan we have done in France and we are going to do.
Oh, great. Thank you. So, Minister McKenna, you've got the balancing of the federal government responsibilities, the responsibilities and autonomy of the provinces in many of these areas. Could you say a little bit about your approach and how you are tackling the problem?
Sure. So I think it is really important that we always talk about the environment and the economy going together, because I think that that's the way you bring people together. We worked really hard in Paris. We were there with provinces. We were there with indigenous leaders. We were there with business leaders. We were there with labor. We were there with youth. And that's the only way you get things done. I'm just a practical person, and this is hard. Hard things are hard, but we know that we need to, apparently need to fix our microphone. Is it good? People can hear me? We need to, we really do need to bring people together. We are stronger together. And I think it's really important we figure out how we do that. And so we had a past government who wouldn't mention the word climate change. I'm the first Minister of the Environment and Climate Change. That was a clear message from our Prime Minister. And everything we do, whether it's internationally, we just hosted a ministerial meeting in Montreal, bringing together ministers around the world, because we've always said if the U.S. is going to step back, we're going to step up. But we also, the week before, we had Indigenous leaders and representatives from countries around the world to talk about how Indigenous peoples were going to benefit from the Paris Agreement. We are training female climate negotiators because I want women at the table. And we have worked really hard to develop our Maiden Climate Plan, which we announced last year. I was extraordinarily proud. And we did that by really working with everyone, and that includes business. So we can't, the Paris Agreement is extraordinarily important. It is non-negotiable, it is irreversible, but it was also a signal to the markets. And I think that's a really exciting piece. We're going to work on the Paris Agreement rulebook, but we also need to look at the huge economic opportunity, and the markets really have moved. So the role of government now is to look at how do we create the right incentives, and I know Larry, I hope he's going to talk about putting a price on pollution, a price on what you don't want, greenhouse gas emissions to foster what you do want, innovation, economic growth. So there's a real opportunity now, but you have to work hard at this, and you have to bring people along. And I say that I'm as much an environment minister for environmentalists as I am for energy workers. Because I'll tell you, you're not going to get things done if you leave people behind. If people cannot understand what you are doing, if you just spend time talking about targets and all sorts of things, like it's too abstract for folks. Most people are just trying to get through the day, put food on the table, get their kids to activities. And so making this case in a real way that we need to save our planet, but there's also a place for everyone. Everyone's going to have jobs. There's going to be economic opportunity. And that's really our message. And actually, it's worked pretty well. You're always going to have people, if you go to my Twitter feed, you can go see. I have people who think I'm not doing enough and other people who don't believe climate change is real. But most people in Canada are pretty good with what we're doing, and we're just working really hard in a way that we didn't see under the past government, where everyone, you're either for the environment or you're for the economy. We know they go together.
Great, thank you. And that is a very natural platform for Secretary Summers because, he has actually applied economics at the highest level to real-world problems and has recently been front and centre of the Climate Leadership Council. What does this aim to do, and how much support are you getting for the initiative, which seems like a wonderful initiative? Is it getting some traction? What else do you think you're going to need to do to make it fly?
I start with the view that in the United States, if you want to get things done, you have to have an approach that has a chance of being bipartisan. And I start with the view that you're not going to win fighting this as a holy war to save the planet. You're more likely to win proposing win-win solutions that appeal to many different constituencies. And that's the idea behind the Climate Leadership Council. And that's the idea behind the carbon dividends approach. It recognizes that the best way to discourage something is to raise its price. It recognizes that the best way for government to mobilize revenue is by taxing things that are bad, like greenhouse gases, rather than things that are good, like working and saving. But it recognizes three other things besides the desirability of putting a price on carbon. It recognizes the central importance of a social dividend, rebating the revenues from that carbon tax and rebating them equally to every citizen in our country, so that an extra dollar is a higher percentage of the income of somebody who makes $15,000 a year than somebody who makes $150,000 a year. Second, it recognizes that there's a broad strategic choice. You can have government order everybody around on every detail of how they're going to design their power plant, of what kind of appliances they're going to put in their bathroom, of what the precise standards on insulation are going to be for their buildings. Or you can let the market decide all that, but let the market decide all that in the context of a price that people know on what we want to discourage, carbon. And so it's carbon taxation, greenhouse gas taxation, social dividend, regulatory relief and certainty, and it's uncertainty that is what businesses hate most, and border adjustment. No one wants to fight this alone. Americans are not going to support doing what's necessary if the result is going to be that American workers are going to lose jobs to people who are not prepared to do what's necessary. And that's why a border tax adjustment for those who don't impose equivalent burdens is a crucial part of the proposal as well. It's been endorsed by Republican Secretaries of State and Treasury, Jim Baker and George Shultz, by 4 leading oil companies, by a range of major corporations, and it can do more for protecting the planet than anything else. Its day will come.
Can I just
Thank
jump
you.
in?
Yeah, please.
So, I mean, I totally agree with what you're saying. I think that this outcomes base, like, we need to just focus on how do we reduce emissions and how do we bring people together. I met George Shultz and we had it's amazing, he's an amazing person, but we had a good discussion about this. I mean, in Canada, one of the first things the Prime Minister did was that he announced we're going to have a price on pollution across the country. But you have to be smart about it. We actually already have many provinces that have a price on pollution, and the best example actually is British Columbia. So what they did is they brought in a revenue-neutral carbon price that they give back, so that you pay up front, so you factor in your decisions. How can you pay less? Businesses are very smart. They will figure out how to pay less. You're not told how you do it, but you got to reduce your emissions. And then the money goes back to people. And I think that is, and they've been able to show that you can decouple economic growth, so you want economic growth from emissions. And that's the model, really, we want. We're still doing regulation in Canada, but our regulation is all outcome-based. We don't want to be prescriptive and tell folks how to do it. We just need to reduce emissions. On the carbon, border carbon adjustment, I think that's really the next phase. I'm originally a trade lawyer, so maybe one day we can get this into the WTO, because of course you don't want businesses going to other jurisdictions where you can pollute more. And so being smart about this. But there's also a great example. California has a market that's linked with Quebec, and Ontario's coming on board. And so there are good models of how you can do that. That's not necessarily the model you're talking about across the board, but everyone has to start putting a price on pollution and realizing it's not free to pollute. It's actually a tax on future generations. It's a tax on my kids because we're ruining their planet. And the more we start talking about this and mainstreaming it, I think the better off we will be. And the more we can bring in companies, unusual suspects, I say, the better and more resilient these policies will be.
Great, thank you. And maybe we could hear a little bit about the Fringe Plan, which you mentioned, and how that's tackling the outcomes which both Secretary Summers and Minister McKenna have just been emphasising.
I don't know if the word coherence is the same in French in
Oui,
English.
c'est ça.
Yes. So it's very important to be coherent. What scientists ask us to leave underground 80% of the fossil resource. So it's why in our plan, the first decision we took, and I will present a law to our parliament in 2 weeks, I hope they will vote it, to ban definitively all new prospection of fossil resource. That's very important. And in the same way, we will ban coal from electricity production for 2023. And the prospection of new resource is from, at the time of the law, will be on. That's very important because you must give previsibility to the investor. And they will know there is previsibility, but also irreversibility. The rule will not change, so it's quite important. But in the same way, we must reinforce the fiscality against pollution. But if you reinforce, by instance, the price of carbon, you must take this money from tax on work or on production and put on pollution and use this money for what? We will give a lot of advantage to people to change the car, to do isolation in their house or in their flat, and that's all the plan we are going to do. And our ambition now is not only, as we have told in Paris, to reduce from 75% our green gas emission from 1992, it's now to be neutral carbon in 2050.
Thank you so much. We haven't talked much about the international coalitions, but I wondered if any of you would like to say anything about that. I mean, clearly we had an element of the international perspective in relation to the border tax, because that will require everybody to play on the same level field. But, I mean, what's the future for international coalitions post-Paris? Can we maintain the momentum of Paris at the international level? And what part do the subnational players have in that?
So yes, we are maintaining the coalition. The Paris Agreement is bigger than any one government. 195 governments signed up, but it's also the business gets back to the market has moved. And my priority as we go into COP23, so the next round of discussions, UN discussions around climate, is to really highlight the role of business and have discussions. So the ministerial meeting in Montreal we just had, we brought together environment ministers with entrepreneurs who are doing groundbreaking work. We're capturing emissions from industry and injecting it into like concrete to make stronger concrete. We brought together our pension funds. Pension funds, we need to be doing investments, bringing together companies that are the big companies that are, you know, the major energy companies who get it. They're like with the program, they want a price on pollution. They know that that's the right thing to do, and it also creates the right incentives. Also, you talked about subnationals, so in the Paris, that's kind of the Paris Agreement lingo, but states, provinces, and we work extremely closely with states. I spent a lot of time in California, New York. Jay Inslee, I think he's here as well from Washington State. So there's a lot going on there in Canada, provinces as well. But just on the business piece, so we're now in a NAFTA renegotiation, and one of the things we're talking about how it's a competitive advantage to have stronger environmental standards and that we're open for business. Like Canada is going to be, we are out there saying, come invest in our country because we know where the future is going. And Mark Carney has called this a $30 trillion economic opportunity. He's one of our greatest exports that we need to get back from the Bank of England at some point. But this is where I think we need to move. Like the Paris Agreement negotiations are going to be hard, but we have the agreement, and it's really how do we get everyone on board, including business, and making sure we have the investment we need.
Great. Secretary Summers, you wanted to.
Let me say what comity precludes our foreign friends from saying. The United States' withdrawal from Paris was the worst instance of U.S. international abdication since our failure to ratify the League of Nations treaty. It is profoundly demoralizing to the global effort. The global effort will continue, and ultimately the United States will find its way back to the path of reason and be part of it. But no one should minimize what a consequential and disastrous act that was. I hope the signs that the administration is trying to do a kind of implicit 180 and reverse itself while never claiming to change its position amount to something. But for the largest, most powerful, most dynamic nation in the world to retreat was a profoundly consequential and terrible, in my judgment, act.
Okay.
I think that we do need we are going to ultimately, though, I believe, need more than goodwill. We are going to need a system where you are rewarded for cooperating and penalized for not cooperating. And that's why I believe the border adjustment concept is crucial to any ultimate international climate architecture.
Thank you. Minister.
Just one thing was, of course, important, and we agree with that. Paris Agreement is not only a paper where 170 states put their signature. No, it's more of that. It's an oath, a promise we have done to our children. And we cannot lie to our children. So we must always say Paris Agreement is non-negotiable and is irreversible. That's the first steps.
Thank you. Now, I hope you'll agree that in quite a short time we covered some really important topics there. We had some fantastic insights from the Secretary and the two ministers around the themes of really focusing on the outcomes, getting the action, doing so in a just way and in a way that brings the people affected along. So although some of our discussion went a bit broader than the concept of coalition, it really was about building coalitions for action and getting that action in a progressive and just way, involving businesses and involving all the various players, but with government giving the market a key role because they too can actually accelerate and help, as Minister Hulot has just said, to make all of this truly irreversible. I'm sure you'll want to thank me in just a moment, join me in just a moment in thanking the panel, but could I just say that the next panel will start at 11:30 prompt, so you have 10 minutes to grab a coffee and bring it back. But please join me in thanking our tremendous panelists.